So, was it in that little house in Ephesus that Our Lady spent her last days? Was it here or in Jerusalem that Jesus' mother passed away? And after all, did Mary die, or was she assumed into heaven, or could both things have happened? First Mary fell asleep, and then she was assumed. This little house here in Ephesus, known as the House of Mary, has become one of the biggest Catholic pilgrimage sites in the world. And I came here so we can investigate together using historical documents and archaeology as well. So how were the last days of Our Lady after all? Let's go back in time together. Let's go to about 50 years after Christ. And then I ask you, who was the first to write about the mother of Jesus? Are you thinking maybe of an evangelist? Luke? Mark? Matthew? No. The first one to write about the mother of Jesus was Paul the Apostle. We imagine that this happened shortly after the crucifixion, but there's an important detail. Paul didn't say what the name of Jesus' mother was. Paul never mentions the name Mary. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that He might redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive the status of sons. It was only a good while later, already after the year 70, when the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem happened, that the author of the Gospel of Mark spoke, or rather wrote for the first time, the name Mary, and revealed to us that Mary was the name of the mother of Jesus. This happened when Mark was recounting an episode that took place in a synagogue when Jesus was giving a speech, a sermon, and was impressing the listeners. Isn't this the carpenter, Mary's son and brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? The first great moment of Mary in the Gospels is the Annunciation, when she becomes pregnant with the one who would later be understood as the Savior of humanity. Another very remarkable episode is that of a certain wedding in Cana, when Mary suggested to her son that he do something to solve the problem of the lack of wine. And the Gospel of John tells us that Jesus turned water into wine. But after all, what do the Gospels tell us about the last days of Mary, about the death of Mary? Is there any mention of a funeral for Our Lady in the Gospels? Any mention of Mary's journey to Ephesus? None. Any reference to the moment of the Dormition or Assumption of Mary? Nothing in the Gospels. The last reference to Mary in Luke, Matthew, Mark, or John is at the moment of the crucifixion. And that gives us an important clue. Mary was in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus' death. Did she stay there for some more time or travel somewhere else? The mystery about what happened in Mary's last days? The lack of any historical record of where she went, where she slept, whose house she stayed in, who took her in immediately. We don't have any of that written down. And this mystery, this lack of historical record, led to the emergence of two main versions about what happened to Maria in her final days. The first one takes us to Jerusalem. I can imagine at first Maria being very traumatized by the violent death of her son. After everything she saw, on the way of the cross, after all she witnessed, in front of the cross, supported by the apostles, taken by them to the refuge where they had to hide so they wouldn't be arrested like Jesus was. I imagine Maria Magdalena also comforting Mary, calming the mother of Jesus. And I can also imagine that Mary took part in the first moments of the lives of Jesus' followers without the Master. When James, described in the Gospels as Jesus' brother, leads the congregation. But after that, where did Mary go to live? Who took Mary in? Where did she go? How was her farewell? The second sermon of St. Joseph of Damascus says that the apostles, all of them except Thomas, were instantly transported from different parts of the world at the moment when Mary rested, and they buried her body. On the third day, when they opened the tomb for veneration, they did not find the body. Therefore, the news that Mary was assumed into heaven after being buried dates back to the 6th century, and this will become the official position of the Vatican, as we will see later. Free from original sin, Mary would have been spared the suffering of death. She died while sleeping or had a painless death, which is known in Greek belief as the dormition of the Theotokos, the bearer of God. Mary would have risen on the third day and been taken up to heaven in body and soul. But why is Mary's ascent to heaven called the Assumption, while Jesus's is called the Ascension? What we're told is that Jesus rose by his own power, and Mary would have been taken to the kingdom of heaven. The tradition of the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate says that the apostles carried Mary's body from Mount Zion to the place where her tomb is, where I have been a few times. The site is managed by the Armenian Apostolic Church and the Greek Patriarchate of Jerusalem. The Greeks explain that there are disagreements about the origins of the devotion at this site. One of them attributes the discovery of the tomb to the journey of Saint Helena, the mother of the Roman Emperor Constantine, who in the year 325 went there with a team of religious figures and historians and ordered the construction of this underground church still in the 4th century. If there's a place in the world that we can call Mary's tomb, folks, it's this one, the oldest. If there's any place where we can believe that the body of Jesus' mother was laid, I'm standing in front of it here in Jerusalem. In the Valley of Final Judgment, it's not by chance also called the Valley of Jehoshaphat, where the Jews wanted to be buried to be close to the temple on the day of Final Judgment. And we see a hole up here. It's not by chance. Where the body of Our Lady would have passed at the moment of her assumption to heaven, when she was taken up to heaven. It reminds us of the feeling we have at the Holy Sepulchre of Jesus. And we need to know this place and treat this place as the Holy Sepulchre of Mary. The oldest information we have that brings us to this tomb here, it comes from the 5th century, when Empress Pulcheria in Constantinople asked the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Juvenal, to send the remains of Mary to Constantinople, the capital of the empire. Juvenal, knowing that this tomb was empty, replied to the empress that it would be impossible because since her death many centuries before, it was known here in Jerusalem that on the third day the tomb had been found just as we see it now, empty. And also in Jerusalem, not far from the church of the Sepulchre of Mary, where the tomb is, there is another place that corresponds to a very ancient tradition about the last days of the mother of Jesus. The church itself, the Basilica of the Dormition, is relatively recent. It's about 100 years old, but it stands on stones that are believed to be much older. These stones were found at the end of the 19th century and are believed to be part of the structure of the Byzantine Basilica, the Hagia Sion, built in the 5th century on top of the ruins of an early Christian church that was here. The Dormition, according to the understanding of some Christians, is what happened between the end of Mary's life and the Assumption. It means peaceful sleep or death without suffering. And according to this tradition, this very important moment would have happened in Jerusalem. Dormitio Sanctae Mariae in Latin means the sleep of St. Mary. For many Christians, it was exactly in this place here that Saint Mary, the mother of Jesus, had her deathbed. Here, exactly here. Her body would have been placed here before the arrival of Jesus Christ to take her up to heaven. In 1950, Pope Pius XII proclaimed the dogma of the Assumption of Mary, defining as Catholic truth the idea that the mother of Jesus was taken up to heaven in body and soul after finishing her life on earth. These are various ways to interpret and find meaning in one of Christianity's greatest mysteries. The tradition that says Mary came here to Ephesus accompanying the Apostle John is very ancient. It dates back at least to the 3rd century, right at the beginning of Christianity. And here in this place there is one of its historical landmarks, one of its historical confirmations, at least of part of the thesis that supports that Mary came here. I'm standing right where the altar of the Basilica of St. John was in Ephesus. This was the end of the church. The altar was right in front of me. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm standing in front of a tomb. And this is the sacred tomb of John. The tomb that tradition tells us is that of the Apostle John. Since the 2nd century, we've had information passed on by Bishop Polycarp of Ephesus to Pope Victor that John was buried here, and an archaeological excavation carried out in the 20th century between the years 1926 and 1928 brought back all the remains, all these ruins that we're seeing here of the great Basilica of St. John. And the archaeologists only finished their work when they said they had found the true tomb of the apostle. This one where I am right now. He would have been accompanied by John. Buried here in Ephesus since Mary likely came here. And it's no coincidence that here in the ruins of Ephesus there is also a church of St. Mary, a church dedicated to Mary that even in the 5th century served as the seat for the Council of Ephesus, when the orthodoxy of the church decided that Mary was Theotokos, the bearer of God, the mother of God. So there is a lot in the Christian tradition that brings us here to Ephesus. Well, and I am in a very sacred place here. We need to stop for a moment to reflect. I am standing before the place that tradition tells us, and archaeology confirmed in the last century, where the tomb of the Apostle John is located. And here it is written Saint John in Mezari, which in Turkish means tomb of Saint John. Have you ever wondered what each moment of Mary's life was like? Well, now you can embark on a journey of faith, history, and tradition with me. Climb every step that leads us to know the Mother of Jesus Christ better. It's the first time I'm seeing Mary's little house. Right in front of me, not just in a photo or video. A very strong tradition has been growing in our time, which says that Mary spent her last days here, where I am, in this little stone house in Ephesus, an ancient city of Asia Minor that belonged to the Roman Empire, now Turkey. But did Mary really live in this house? Did she spend her last days here? By the end of this special, I will answer that question. But first, I will present to you all the hypotheses that could say yes or no to the question I just asked you. And, of course, we will learn details about the story of Maria's house here in Ephesus. The sources leading us to the little house of Ephesus are quite recent. They are based on the visions of German nun Anne Catherine Emmerich, who lived from the late 1700s to early 1800s. John had a house built for the Blessed Virgin. Christian families and holy women had already settled here, some in caves in the ground or in the rocks. They had come here to escape the violent persecution. Their dwellings were like hermit cells, as they used what nature offered them as a refuge.
Maria's house was the only one built of stone.
A little behind it was the summit of the rocky hill, from where you could see, over the trees and hills, Ephesus and the sea with its many islands. Maria's house was built of rectangular stones, rounded or pointed at the back, and the windows were high near the flat roof. Sister Anne Catherine Emmerich reportedly saw the inside of Maria's house. The house was divided into two compartments by the fireplace in the center. The fireplace was on the floor opposite the door. It was sunken into the floor next to a wall that rose in steps on each side up to the ceiling. In the center of that wall, a deep channel with half of a chimney carried the smoke upward to escape through an opening in the roof. I saw a slanted copper funnel projecting above the roof over that opening. If that part of the house was needed as a large room, those screens, which didn't even reach the ceiling, were taken down and set aside. Those screens were used as rooms for Maria's maid and for other women who came to visit her. It's important to note that this view assumes that when she came to live in Ephesus, Our Lady would have become very rich, or at least wealthy, because she had a slave, a servant, which at that time was probably a slave. Not just anyone had a servant, not just any person. Besides that, she was the only one who had a stone house, while the others lived in caves. Of course, we can understand that it was a special care from the one who brought her here, according to this tradition, the Apostle John. Of course, Anne Catherine Emmerich continues. To the right and left of the fireplace, doors led to the back part of the house, which was darker than the front part and ended in a semicircle or angle. It was arranged in an orderly and pleasant way. The ceiling was vaulted, its beams were decorated and ornamented with a leaf pattern. It was all simple and dignified. The literary work created from the visions of the nun Anne Catherine Emmerich only reached us because of the manuscripts of the German poet Clemens Brentano, whose text was edited, and it is believed altered by Father Karl Schmoger. According to this text, which tells us what was said to be the visions of Anne Catherine Emmerich, and also according to a vast tradition, Mary is said to have come here to Ephesus accompanied by the Apostle John. And this tradition is based on chapter 19 of John, which talks about the crucifixion of Jesus. More precisely, verses 26 and 27. They recount what was Jesus' point of view from the top of the cross and what he said or is believed to have said. Standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother's sister, Mary of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Then Jesus, seeing his mother standing there and the disciple whom he loved, said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his home. I've been talking about John 19 verses 26 and 27 for some time now, because it's one of those cases in the history of Christianity where a single interpretation of an imprecise phrase ended up leading to a huge idea which turned into a huge tradition. Like, for example, the case of Magdalene as a prostitute based on Pope Gregory's interpretation back in the 6th century, an imprecise interpretation made during a homily. In this case, we start with a statement by Irenaeus, who connected John the Apostle with John the Evangelist, stating that they would have come here saying that John had a very close relationship with Jesus, but not saying that he was the beloved disciple. And then this idea grows. Eusebius of Caesarea already states that John is the beloved disciple. This tradition keeps growing. Ephesus keeps growing because it was a place where one of the two had been either John the Evangelist or John the Apostle. The tradition will realize the two were the same person. And from there comes the whole idea that Mary came here to Ephesus accompanying the Apostle John. And it all starts with John 19 verses 26 and 27. But after all, how did they identify the exact house that had been seen by the nun, Anne Catherine Emmerich? How were they sure it was the same house? At the end of the 19th century, using the description that appears in the book, the French priest Julien Gay climbed this mountain and found this stone house and returned to France announcing his discovery. He had found the house of Our Lady, but do you know what happened? Father Guy was ridiculed. Then a decade later, two Christian missionaries climbed these mountains again, came here and rediscovered the house. But this time, when they spoke about the house of Our Lady, they accepted. And then a tradition began to emerge that grew stronger and stronger to the point that today it has practically become a truth. And for many people, it's indisputable that this is the house where Maria spent her last days. Shall we understand this better? Shall we go inside the house now? This is the most important moment for those who come here. The house of Our Lady in Ephesus is increasingly considered a sacred place. This is a very emotional moment. It has been more than a century since a tradition tells us that this is the house of Our Lady here, and there is a great energy brought by the Christians who come here. Thinking about Our Lady, reflecting on what her life was like, imagining her final years in this small house atop the mountain, once part of the great Roman city of Ephesus. Maybe fleeing from persecution. Maybe just wanting seclusion for the end of her life. After all she endured during Jesus' crucifixion, and also what happened afterwards with all the persecution of the Christians and the apostles, even though we have no way to prove it, that this was the residence of Maria, that she really lived here in her last years, even though it's more likely that she lived in Jerusalem. The energy here is intense. It was my first visit. I keep from that experience a moment of reflection, meditation, and connection with everyone who has passed and will continue to pass through here. There is a belief here that the water coming from these faucets comes from a spring that emerged exactly where Our Lady used to sleep when she lived in this house. That's what belief and tradition say. And that this water here has miraculous powers, which, for example, would be able to cure infertility, And here, right next to the spring, people leave notes and messages asking for blessings and thanking Our Lady. The recognition of the devotional value of the house of Ephesus came little by little. In 1896, Pope Leo XIII authorized pilgrimages to the place. In 1951, Pope Pius XII gave the House of Mary the status of a sacred place in Catholicism. After that, Popes Paul VI, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI visited the house. But the Vatican has never stated that Mary spent her last days here, nor that her burial or assumption into heaven happened here. As I promised at the beginning, I will now say what I understand actually happened. What historical research and 2,000 years of accumulated knowledge provide as information. First, I want to say the emotion here is strong. We feel very close to Our Lady. The devotion brings to this place a very deep feeling of respect and admiration for Mary, the Mother of Jesus. And I feel that here in Ephesus. I feel it in the little stone house here in Ephesus. I felt it the moment I entered the house. I entered multiple times to calmly look around and review details. But what I can really say is that Maria spent her last days in Jerusalem. And that's why, since the earliest centuries, there has been a tomb of Maria there. A tradition reaffirmed in the last century by Pope John Paul II that Maria died in Jerusalem. She was buried there precisely in the Valley of the Final Judgment, where the Jews of that time wanted to be buried, a place of great honor, and that from there her body disappeared after a few days, giving rise to a very deep belief that her body was assumed into heaven. The house of Ephesus endures forever. For me, a very positive memory of closeness to Maria, a deep devotional experience. But I really can't say, I don't have any evidence to say, nor do I know any researcher who has supported that hypothesis. Everything leads me to say that this is just a very symbolic house of great devotion, the house of Maria in Ephesus.